So, world economics works the way America wants to have hegemony with their currency and enslave the rest of the world, to colonialize the rest of the world with their currency and derive the imports from the rest of the world, because they want to peg the world to the petrodollar. Greenbacks, Washington, D.C. wants to peg the world energy fossil fuel on the petrodollar as the world reserve currency. And they also want to be able to export from the third world unlimited consumption of raw uh, materials, whether it be from minerals, uh, metals, manufactured, exploited laborers throughout the world to consume imports from the rest of the world. America wants to enslave the world when it comes to America's currency, and that's the way it's set up to tariff nations, to sanction nations, and to keep them under the hegemony of the whims of Washington and the capital politicians in Washington. And I think that no, the world shouldn't be enslaved to one nation's whims when it comes to their economical greed. So when it comes to their economical greed, I don't condone Washington enslaving the rest of the world to be pegged on the greenback of America's currency. So you have the BRIC movement that are between Brazil, South Africa, India, China, and Russia. You have the BRIC movement. You have other nations that want to join, because the other nations in the third world don't want to be enslaved and held captive. When they say money is the root of all law, excuse me, the saying that says money is the root of all evil? Well, all roads lead back to Washington, D.C. And when one nation thinks that they have the prestige to unbound all the planet's sovereign nations around the planet to their monetary greed of foreign affairs, to me that seems unfair. That's the reason slavery existed. That's the reason third worlds are stuck in poverty and perpetual exploitation when it comes to the first world economical order between America uh, pegging every nation to the whims of the ambitions of Capitol Hill politicians in Washington. So when the world is pegged to run on America's currency, you're basically enslaving the world to the monetary policies of greedy, power hungry Washington D.C. politicians, and the world becomes more disenfranchised through tariffs and through sanctions. America controls the World Bank, the IMF, the Bank of Settlement, the SWIFT system. America floats the gasoline pegged on a greenback. And so that's why it shouldn't be a surprise that nations are dropping the greenback, because they refuse to be enslaved by this colonial money, by Washington trying to colonize the whole world and exploit it for raw materials, precious metals, exports by exploited laborers in third world impoverished regions. So while America is making out like a robber baron, the rest of the world is stuck in poverty and in ruins and disenfranchised. So for that reason, I'm calling to the world, sovereign nations, to wean themselves off the petrodollar or the greenback as a well-reserved status currency, I want the world to liberate themselves and to have equal opportunities to flourish their countries in prosperity instead of being controlled as an economical slave nations by Washington, D.C., the whims of Washington, D.C., and their corrupt, greed mongering, bipartisan leaders that loves to enslave the rest of the world to the greed mongering of this delusional world economical world currency, American reserve status or hegemony that the world has to run based on the whims of Americans' politics. So the BRIC movement is a start in the right direction, but eventually it will have to include other members that will join, and it will evolve. So it won't be just the BRIC name. Eventually will be altered and changed as other member nations join a multi-bipolar economical order. What I'm calling for is central banks of regions. So the central bank of South America, the central bank of Africa, the central bank of Asia, the central bank of the Middle East, the central bank of the Eastern Europeans. These central banks should monitor, first of all, liberate themselves from the enslavement of America's greed currency, liberate themselves from the greenback, and their central banks supposed to concentrate on economical prosperity within their regions, and that every nation's currency should have the equal purchasing power of any other nation. So all the currencies in the world of sovereign nations have equal purchasing power, and no one nation can devaluate another nation's currency as far as purchasing power, and not one nation can have the right to impose economical tariffs or economical sanctions on any other nation. So when it comes to current economies of nations, they should be sovereignly protected by being considered equal as any other nation when it comes to their currencies. So what I'm insinuating that all nations' currencies have equal purchasing power, and that there's no one nation that can have the world reserve status as far as their currencies having hegemony and dominance like America has enslaved the rest of the world under the whims of their greed, or may I say the root, the money is the root of all evil when it comes to the greenback and their unlimited greed in Washington. But as far as all nations having their central banks of their regions have the priorities on developing wealth for their regions and lifting third world nations in their regions out of poverty. And that every nation's currency is supposed to have the same purchasing power. And that no nation can be devaluated when it comes to their purchasing power of their currencies, of their sovereign currencies. And that no nation can inflict economical tariffs or sanctions on any other nation. That will be outlawed from happening. And when it comes to nation having discrete abilities to economically deal with any other nation they feel like economically trading with, they can have digital accounts. Digital accounts that any nation can bargain with any nation and have their own digital accounting that is sovereignly kept confidential between those nations. And so any nation can trade with any other nation and have digital accounts. Besides currencies, they can have digital accounts along with currency. But let's say when one nation wants to trade with another nation and they want to do it confidential trading, discrete trading, so they can have digital accounts that would allow nations to trade with other nations and discreetly keep it confidential between their uh, accords of nations trading with other nations. So any nation can trade with any other nation and keep it digitally discreet and confidential. And no nation can impose tariffs, economical tariffs, or sanctions to devaluate a nation's economies. And that every nation currency has the same equal purchasing power throughout the world. So these type of systems, the currencies have an equal purchasing power and safeguarding sovereign nations' wealth from economical tariffs and economical sanctions, and also phasing in digital accounts. So discreetly, one nation can trade with any other. One nation can trade with other nations discreetly, confidentially, secretly. Nations can have digital accounts with each other to trade commodities, imports and exports. And this is what I call my theory of wealth of nations, sort of an evolution of Adam Smith. The theory of morality when it comes to raising the third world from poverty and liberating them from the shackles of enslavement of this greenback currency that has a hegemony of enslaving the world to the whims of Washington's greed. So for that reason, I'm calling for an elimination of that economical status of America having the world reserve status. And no nation on the planet should have that right to enslave the rest of the world with their currency and use it as an economical weapon. That should be outlawed. So all nations should have their sovereign currencies throughout the world that have equal purchasing power as every other nation. So every nation has their sovereign currencies have equal purchasing power. So all nations will have their currencies having the ability to have the same purchasing power. And the central banks of these regions, the central bank of South America, the central bank of Africa, the central bank of Asia, the central bank of the Middle East, the central bank of Eastern Europe, their constructed purposes is to rise up the poverties of their inhabitants of their regions, to rise the third world up from poverty, and to have the ability to raise these third world regions and make them prosperous, economically prosperous. At the same time, all nations should have the right to trade with other nations and keep it confidential. If they want to trade and keep it discreet, every nation has the sovereign right to trade with any nation on the world they want to trade with, and no other nation should interfere, regardless of political rhetoric. So any nation can purchase commodities with digital accounts discreetly, that those accounts are digitally kept secret between nations if they want to trade with each other confidentially and keep it discreet and not disclose those economical trading accords. They can have digital accounts and trade regardless of the political rhetoric throughout the world politics. Nations can trade with each other, and no nation should have the right to impose tariffs or sanctions on any other nation, regardless of what nation that wants to inflict economical tariffs or sanctions. No nation should have that right to impoverish regions and impoverish the inhabitants of sovereign nations and keep their populations in starving and in poverty. That shouldn't be tolerated. So this is my manifesto of the theory of morality and the wealth of nations. It's like an evolutionary Adam Smith's kind of theory. I'm evolutionizing and evolving Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations and the theory of morality when it comes to economical trading. I'm the father of this economical theory.